Hello and welcome to my presentation on mental health resources in Halifax Regional School Board libraries. First, a brief introduction to the HRSB, which is my employer. It's the largest school board in Atlantic Canada with approximately 48,000 students in 136 schools. And for this assignment, I looked at the 49 schools which include grades 9 and or 10 because the board has implemented a mental health curriculum for these grades, and I wanted to examine how library collections meet the needs of that curriculum. Like many school libraries, the HRSB libraries have been in decline for a very long time. We've gone in the past 30 years from a budget of $14 per student per year for acquisitions down to less than $5 per student. There are no teacher librarians in the HRSB, and only high schools and some large junior highs have full-time staff members. Last year, the board reduced the central library consultant position to 20%, and that position is actually held by a literacy coach, not a librarian. So before I began this assignment, I had some idea of what I might find, because lack of time, money, and leadership do not make for healthy library collections. Before I look at the collections themselves, though, I'll briefly discuss why I chose to look at mental health resources. The Canadian Mental Health Association estimates that 10 to 20% of Canadian youth are affected by mental health disorders, so clearly there is a crisis, and only 1 in 5 Canadian children in need of mental health services is able to access them. That's also true in the school boards, because in HRSB, students can wait up to 3 years for a consultation with a school psychologist. But obviously the scope of mental health is really broad, so I had to narrow my focus in some way, and I reviewed the HRSB's mental health curriculum and chose to look at resources only dealing with mood disorders, depression and bipolar disease, and teen suicide. Clearly, the importance of quality library resources in these areas should be self-evident, but my findings indicate that that is not the case. So in the collection evaluation, I discovered 111 unique titles with a total of 322 copies in the system. The collection is overwhelmingly comprised of print monographs, but it should be noted that the province provides access to EBSCO databases for all students. 2 things about the collection are particularly alarming. First is usage. 24% of titles were never borrowed, 45% borrowed 5 times or less. This could be attributed to an overall decline in students' use of print resources, but could also be related to the collection itself, age and relevance. So it would be interesting to see if that changes if and when collections are updated. Even more concerning, though, is the age of the mental health resources, with the average date of publication 2002, and for suicide resources dropping even further to 1998. I think this is partially attributable to the fact that HRSB has no library-specific collection policy. Library resources fall under the General Learning Resources Policy, which was last updated in 1999, and the only reference to weeding suggests that items should be removed when they're no longer appropriate. Now, HRSB Technical Services refers staff to a brochure compiled by the California Department of Education, but that brochure I found out is based on the CREW method, developed by Texas State Library and Archives, and I believe that method to be the most appropriate weeding method for the HRSB. So it's the one that I used. A little bit more about CREW. It consists of both objective and subjective criteria for weeding. So resources are evaluated objectively in terms of age and circulation stats, and subjective analysis is determined by the must-eat criteria, which most of us know already. So it suggests that evaluators look at whether an item is misleading, ugly, superseded, trivial, irrelevant, or readily available elsewhere. CREW guidelines for the Dewey 610s, which include mental health, and 360s, which include suicide, are 5-3 musty, so 5 years since publication, 3 since circulation. But it's important to remember that outdated medical information can actually be dangerous, so it should be really weeded ruthlessly. Several sources note that collections for children and youth require attention to currency and accuracy, especially as young people might be less likely to check publication dates and might assume that if an item is in the library, then it's accurate. For this reason, but also because sometimes good materials get overlooked unless they're promoted, publication date is a more important consideration than date of last circulation when weeding youth collections. So with these criteria in mind, 93 of the 111 resources are recommended for deselection and disposal. This decision is based almost exclusively on publication date. Because we have such a limited budget, I have to admit this recommendation feels really strange, but it is also so important to understand that something can actually be worse than nothing. Now, when it comes to rebuilding the collections, I chose to interpret the $600 budget as a one-time grant for each library, and I selected my resources according to the following criteria: that they should support the HRSB mental health curriculum, should be both current and reputable, should reflect diversity, should be appropriate for age and grade level of users, and should encompass both print and electronic resources. I ended up selecting 11 books, 3 complete series, including a series of online mental health magazines directly tied to the curriculum, and 1 video study guide. My primary selection tool was the Children's Literature Comprehensive Database, which allows users to limit searches by grade level, reader's age, reading metrics, and other facets, which makes it really good for school libraries. The database also includes reviews from trusted sources like School Library Journal and CM Magazine, so it allows for assessment of titles without using multiple sources. And I also checked other Canadian school library catalogs, Amazon chapters, and things like that. I chose not to include ebooks at this time because they're not accessible through our OPAC, and I thought licenses would be better navigated at the board level. And the most important findings in this whole process was the fact that libraries are just one part of what needs to be a collaborative, holistic, learner-centered approach to developing HRSB's mental health resources. So this will include discussion among library staff, administrators, school mental health professionals, even community partners, to provide students and educators with current, reliable, and relevant information. So library resources are part of this, but access to online resources, websites, community forums are really important too. And what we want to do is make sure that the library becomes a safe space for students, including those with mental health issues. So to this end, I've recommended the development of a library pathfinder, which I really hope can start to bring these resources together. As for challenges, it was more challenging than I expected to find good quality recent materials on mood disorders and suicide. I was particularly surprised by the lack of Canadian information and information related to LGBTQI and Indigenous experience with mental health. I expected there to be more available than the ubiquitous educational publisher series. This again highlights, though, the importance of providing access to quality online material. By far, though, the most frustrating thing about the assignment is knowing how important it is to actually make it a reality and how problematic it will be to put it into action. Because no matter how much sense it makes, and even given the danger of providing outdated information to students, the lack of central library governance, money, and qualified staff is going to make buy-in very difficult to obtain. So thanks for listening. I'll include a complete list of my references when I post this to eClass.